This week on the Computer Chronicles, a visit to the Macworld Expo in Boston. Though Apple did introduce several new Macintosh computers at this Macworld Expo, the company says its focus in the future will be on streamlining its product line.
In the hardware side, we've got a few things we want to focus on. First and foremost is we want fewer core products. What you're going to see over time is that we're going to simplify the product line. I might actually be able to remember what all the models mean.
Hey everybody, it's Ron with Ron's Computer Videos. I want to thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day and spending it here with us. We got a great interview today. Let's get right to it. He's a consulting systems engineer and former member of Apple's national education team, Mr. John Tucker. John, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you. It's a beautiful day here in southern New Mexico.
Well, that's good. It's we're finally getting like some more fall-like weather.
Yeah.
I live in Missouri, and we've had a couple of days where it's still like 86 degrees.
Yeah, it's been warm here, but the last few days it's been raining, and so here in the desert when it rains, it's really kind of nice.
Very nice. Well, let me ask you this: how did you get started with computers? How did this amazing story start?
It's really interesting. I when I was in high school, it's really interesting. A lot of people that have gotten involved in the personal computer business or the computer business, their first experience was in high school. I had a free class period in high school, and I wasn't particularly artistic or anything, so I wasn't in band. I mean, I played football until a good friend of mine decided to tackle the back of my knee rather than the running back that I was trying to bring down. And so that kind of ended my football career. And then as a senior, I had a free period, and my senior math teacher worked it out so that I could early enroll at the local university, New Mexico State University. And I was fortunate enough to get a class that was in the middle of the day, so I could drive across town, because the high school I went to was literally completely across town in Las Cruces. New Mexico State University is where I went to school. And this math class had a lab associated with it. It was an introduction to calculus class taught by the head of the math department. And in the math department, there was a little closet, and it had a IBM terminal in there. Now, terminal in 1971 was a Selectric typewriter with an I/O capability that ran at about 110 baud, connected up to the IBM mainframe, and it ran something called ITF Basic, which was a version of Dartmouth Basic that ran on the IBM mainframe. So we did our problems with that, and that's kind of how I started my computer career. But it really started off more the next fall when I started at the university, and I took an introductory engineering class, and the engineering college had an IBM 1130 in the basement of the annex. And this was a single user computer. In fact, that's really interesting. It had a Fortran compiler and a disk drive, but when you used 80 column cards and typed your program in a program, it didn't store the output onto the disk. It would basically punch cards with the binary, and you had to read those back in. But it was my first experience with a computer that I could use all by myself. I then started dating my future wife, a poor lady that's suffered for now for almost 48 years, putting up with me. And I needed gas for the car and money for dates and stuff like that. So I looked for a job, and in high school, I had worked at a bank in the summertime, just as a part-time fill-in kind of kid. And so I went back to the bank, and I was really lucky. The computer department it was a little small bank, had like 6 branches, but they hired college students, males, 3 of them, to run the computer at night. And So I was able to go to work with that. It was really kind of nice because we could swap off days if we had parties to go to or studying or girlfriends, those kinds of things. And so I started working at the bank, and I had a tragedy. I think it was probably the first 10 days or 2 weeks that I'd worked by myself. Now, this computer was the smallest IBM 360 that IBM made. It was a 360 model 20. And it had a card reader punch, 2 5-megabyte disk drives, a line printer, and then a big box, a console. That was it. And so there was the user interface was basically messages that got printed out on the printer or lights that came up on the console. And what happened that night, to actually run the computer, you would take a deck of cards, about 2,000 cards that had all the job control language on them. You take that deck of cards and put it in the card reader and press start, and then it would just run for hours and hours. So while it was running, then we were out there sorting checks at this big, huge machine that was probably 12 feet long that sorted checks, sometimes turned them into accordions and put them all in order. And that's what we did. Well, anyway, this first night, or one of the first nights was on my own, I grabbed the whole deck of cards, turned around, bumped my elbow against the printer, and all the cards fell on the floor.
Ugh.
Now, you have to understand, if you heard anything about key punches back then, there were really what IBM called features when you would buy a machine. And one of the features on a 026 key punch was the ability to actually type what was on the card. And that cost money. And banks, being what banks are, they didn't buy those. So all these cards had holes in them, but you couldn't read them. It scared me to death. It took me about 45 minutes before I could call the vice president of the bank and say, Frank, I dropped the deck of cards. What do I do? I can't run the computer tonight because it doesn't know what to do. He said, well, don't worry. There's an extra deck of cards over in the cabinet. Go over there, but only get about 3 or 4 inches of the cards at a time and transfer them that way. But be careful because that's the only deck we have. And so I learned a lot about backup.
Yes.
And I learned that this was a problem that needed fixing. And so I had switched my major at that time to computer science. And I figured out that the layout of those cards, I have one here for in case somebody's never seen an 80-column card with no holes in it. The last 8 columns from 72 to 80, you could put a sequence number in there. And so I took it upon myself to write a little program on that 360 in, I think, assembly language maybe, that all it did was punch the typical, the first basic program everybody writes, right? Start at 10, add 10, and go loop. And it just punched those. So I could take the deck of cards, put the cards in the card reader, and then punch the sequence number in all of them. And then later, if I ever dropped the deck, I could put it back in the card reader because it had a sort function and it would sort the cards into order. So that's how I started writing programs. I later wrote more programs for the bank, started working during the day as a programmer, wrote accounting systems for the bank. And the bank had actually transitioned from that IBM System 3 or System 360 to a System 3. And it had a machine on it that would read checks. And this was one of the very first financial institutions in the United States that had one of these. And so I worked really hard with IBM and the engineers in Minnesota, in Rochester, Minnesota, to make that machine work, and kind of developed a little bit of a reputation that later on in 1977, I decided to concentrate on getting my degree. And I was looking for another job. IBM found out that I was looking for another job, and so they offered me a job even before I had graduated from college. So I worked for IBM from 1977 until 1984, and spent about half the time as a systems engineer and the other half as a marketing rep or a salesman for IBM. It was really interesting because to know a little bit about how it is around here in southern New Mexico. By the way, I've lived in southern New Mexico almost my entire life. I lived in Denver working for Apple when I first started with Apple for about 6 months, but the rest of the time, for all practicality, I've lived here in southern New Mexico. But anyway, the economy here in New Mexico is agriculture. New Mexico State University is a land grant college. It used to be called New Mexico A&M. Huge ag influence. But also on the other side of the mountains here, that my house is at the base of, or the Rocky Mountains, what they're called the Oregon Mountain Range here, is White Sands Missile Range. And there's a huge influence with White Sands, the big employer. There's actually on this side of the mountain, NASA facility, NASA Johnson Space Center, NASA has a pretty good presence here. So there's a lot of technical orientation toward this area. Anyway, and a lot of IBM's success in this area, it really goes back to the selectric typewriter, and for some odd reason, because when you're writing technical stuff, you have all sorts of Greek symbols and things, and the selectric typewriter being able to change scoff ball made them very, very popular. In fact, they were popular in that time before personal computers became really available. People were buying lots and lots of typewriters for the same reasons people bought personal computers. And what happened was that later in that time, about 1983, 84, actually 1984, there was a small retail place here in Las Cruces that sold Apples, the first Apple IIs and then Macintoshes. And I got to tell you, I fell in love with a Macintosh because I had spent a lot of time at IBM trying to sell word processing on screens that were 80 columns wide and 24 columns, and it was painful. An interesting aside about that was there was a printer that IBM sold at that time on the DisplayWriter, and then later on a shared logic system that I worked on. That was and now I'm drawing a blank of what it was called. I know the nickname of it that the service guys called it. It was a Pray and Spray, but it was an inkjet printer.
Right.
And this inkjet printer was about 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall and about 2 feet deep. And I remember this. It cost to buy one. It was $13,500.
Wow.
And you can buy them for $50, $60 nowadays.
Sure.
That's just to show you how much the computer business has changed. But anyway, so I kind of one of the things I learned at IBM was the company that you work for is very important, but the person you work for is even more important. And one of the changes of IBM, I ended up working for someone that I didn't like, and so I decided to resign from IBM, and I went back to work at New Mexico State University and enjoyed my time there at New Mexico State University. And it was really interesting because it really kind of formed kind of a pathway from a lot of stuff that happened with me later on. One, I fell in love with a Macintosh, and so I started to work at the university, and they didn't have very many Macintoshes at the computing center, because I actually worked at the computer center as a kind of a technical support role on campus. And at that time, this was 1984. PCs had been out a little bit more than a year. Mac had been out just months, and computing on campuses at the time, there was basically the central computing facility that had big IBM mainframes and all the stuff that they did. And then departments that had their own kind of resources would have DECwriter or other kinds of mini computers and stuff. But students generally couldn't use those unless they were enrolled in a class that was, that department, within that department. So the director of the computer center, which was a really interesting fellow, had a Lisa on his desk. When I started to work there, they had 3 Macintoshes. They had 50 IBM PCs in a big room and 3 Macintoshes. And I thought it was really interesting because at that time there were 8 people always standing in line to use those 3 Macintoshes with PageMaker on them.
Oh, yeah.
So I talked to the director of the computer center and said, Joe, we got to do something. Well, the music department got a new building. And so the computer center moved into the old music building, and I convinced the director that we need to build a Macintosh lab. And so we built a Macintosh lab, and we put 32 Macintoshes in the lab and bought 3 laser printers. And lo and behold, there was always 8 people waiting in line to use those Macintoshes, even though there were 32 of them. So In fact, actually, later after going to work for IBM and having the university be one of my customers that I supported, and right before the director retired, I stopped by and talked to him, and he said, I want to say that I had the absolute worst experience of my entire 15 years as director of the computer center at New Mexico State University. And that was, I walked over to the old music building, and he walked by of course, the IBM lab was on the first floor, and the Macintosh lab was in the basement. And so he walked by the first floor and saw that there were a few students. It was right at the end of the semester. They were writing their papers. And he walked into down into the basement of the second floor, and there was a whole long line of students waiting to get into the Macintosh lab. And those students literally booed him as he walked by because they couldn't get in to use the Mac lab. So at that time, there was another friend of mine who was a technical support person for the College of Arts and Sciences. And unfortunately, he was getting a divorce. And he had previously, before working at the university, actually worked at that computer store, was actually the manager of the local Apple computer store. And so he had contacts within Apple, and he got a job as a systems engineer in the Phoenix, Phoenix. To work in Phoenix, the regional office was actually in Denver at that time. And before he left the university, I grabbed him and got around his collar, and I said, Jeff, if you don't call me and let me know the first opening there is at Apple, I will hunt you down. And about 30 days later, he called me and said, hey, they're looking for a systems engineer with technical skills to work in the Denver office. And I said, sign me up. And so with luck of that, I got to work in the Denver office now. And I was really excited about it because at that time, the regional office in Denver covered the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And I thought, I can work in Colorado and maybe get back home into New Mexico because I really am a New Mexico kid. And in the time it took me to actually get accepted to take the job, it was about 3 months before I moved up to Denver. They split the regional office in two. They put Utah and Colorado as one regional office, and Arizona and New Mexico in another regional office with headquarters in Denver and Phoenix. So I lasted about 6 months in Denver, and I really didn't like the guy that I worked for. And so at Thanksgiving in 1988, I decided I was going to resign and go back home and live my life in New Mexico. Because the guy I worked for said, well, we paid for you to move up here, so you have to stay at least a year. And I said, well, I don't know if I can take it for a year. And so I went and started packing up my stuff. And Thanksgiving, bought a U-Haul, loaded up the stuff, and drove home. And then went back to work after that. And I got a call from the guy that actually hired me, was the manager in Phoenix. And he said, hey, why don't you come work for us? And I said, well, Paul up here says I have to stay for it. And I said, don't worry about that. You come work for it.
That seems to be a common thing where it'll just be like, oh, he said that? No, that's fine. Just do this thing anyway.
Another aside, let me tell you the very first thing that I learned at Apple. This is day one. And another thing on day two. The first thing I learned is at Apple Computer, it's much easier to get forgiveness than to get permission.
Sure.
Then on the second day, I learned the answer to this question. Do you know what the difference is between the Boy Scouts and Apple Computer?
No.
That's because the Boy Scouts have adult supervision. So anyway, so I was able to move back, which was really good because my family is from Las Cruces. My wife's family is from Las Cruces. And I knew I'd be traveling a lot. Because basically the work that I did most of the first year that I was back was being the lead systems engineer for the two national labs that are in the Albuquerque area, Los Alamos National Labs and Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque. They were great customers. Los Alamos did as much business at that time as the rest of the Phoenix region. They were over 50% of the business. One of the reasons is that about that time, the bean counters at Los Alamos started charging back for computer time on the supercomputers that they had there, specifically the Crays. And they bought a lot of Macintoshes, Mac 2s, Mac 2FXs, the higher end machines, because there was a good Fortran compiler on it. And so what they could do is they could do all the debugging and testing and making sure the functionality of their codes will work on the Macintosh, and then send it up and have their department pay for Cray time to do that stuff. There's an interesting little hook about Cray also. Seymour Cray moved from Chippewa Falls to Colorado Springs in Colorado while I was working for Apple in Denver. And the very last thing I did officially as a systems engineer for Apple was we took the engineering team and some of the managers from Cray Computing in Colorado Springs out to Cupertino for an executive briefing so they could see the technology that Apple was using specifically around the higher performance computers and stuff like that, and how we built computers and things. So I actually have a Cray 3 coffee cup. Cray 3 was a computer that they never made because unfortunately Cray died in an accident shortly after that. But I was actually in the area and supporting Cray when that statement came out that Apple had purchased a Cray YMP. It was purple in the color. They called it the Crayon, typical Apple kind of a thing. And someone, it was actually the retail salesperson that called on, I don't remember what deal, Microwave or some dealer in Colorado Springs called on Seymour Cray and helped him install his Mac computer and his LaserWriter at home and things like that. And he asked Seymour one day, he said, "Hey, did you know that Apple purchased a Cray computer and they're using that to design the next Macintosh?" And he said, "Well, that's really interesting because I just bought a Macintosh to design the next Cray computer." So yeah, that was really interesting times. I really enjoyed, but then I traveled actually the whole time. In the 15 years I worked for Apple, I worked out of my home, and after supporting the customers at the national labs, that was a time where Apple had an awful lot of reorganizations, a lot of kind of management turmoil. They really couldn't decide how to go to market. I mean, this is my opinion, okay? In that you had this, it's interesting, one of the systems engineers in the Phoenix office was a mechanical engineer, actually worked for a company that in the Phoenix area that tested jet engines. He can be told stories about throwing frozen turkeys into the running engines of a jet airplane.
Oh, yeah.
But he said that management philosophy at Apple is like an undamped oscillator. And that's because they couldn't decide if they should be a direct sales organization or they should rely on a completely retail business. So they would basically move their money and employees both ways. They would hire a bunch of internal people. When I first started, they built these huge palatial regional offices. The regional office in Denver was 2 floors in a 20-floor high-rise building, equipped to have a whole half floor for training and then room for 74 employees on the employee floor. The Phoenix office was the same, huge building, a lot of real estate, really expensive. And I found out how much they were paying for it per month. I about fell out of my chair. And then, they would decide, well, no, we need to put more money and incentive resellers into selling our computers and stuff. And, back and forth, and they would do this binge and purge thing. They would hire a bunch of internal employees, and then they would lay them off, and they would go back and forth. Yeah. I was a little frightened when I started with Apple because when I started, there were about 16,700 employees, and after a year, there were over 25 or 26,000 employees, and I had a hard time with that. I didn't understand how you could assimilate that many people, and into a company that's as culturally rich as Apple. How could you do that?
Well,
So
the
they,
story that you hear a lot of times is that you had people, especially in these areas that were like, there's a North Carolina office, and the
mhm.
people in the North Carolina office have their own culture that does not jive with the corporate culture of the rest of Apple. And it was like just trying to get these people in the tent. So I hear you on that.
Yeah. So anyway, the folks in the Phoenix office were really very successful. I don't know if it was because they were real politically oriented or what, but the regional manager and the sales manager then really became pretty big stars in the company. And when they had one of the organizations where they were really talking about a lot of the field people, a lot of the customer facing, kind of employees, that they were going to reduce the numbers of those. They pulled me aside and said, we really want you to join the education team and support the education customers. And it was really kind of a protective move. I greatly appreciated it. So that's when I moved over more into the education side of the business, because it was really significantly more stable.
Sure.
So then I did that and supported all of the universities in the Arizona and New Mexico areas, and traveled around a bit. And that was after that was when I became the consulting systems engineer, because the structure that Apple had with those customers they dealt with directly, which almost exclusively through that whole time was with education. There'd be a sales rep that was assigned to the K-12 customers and the higher ed customers that dealt with Apple directly, issued purchase orders and things like that. And then there would be a systems engineers that would those kind of help there to help with the technical sources. The consulting engineers in education, which there were actually 10. There were 2 specialists that just kind of had multimedia specialties, and then another one that was a networking specialist. But then there were 4 of us that were assigned to higher ed, and 4 of us that were assigned to K-12, and we covered basically a third to a quarter of the country, and I did that for really quite a while, and I enjoyed that because you got to go to big universities, and I traveled really a great deal. I was at one time at least in the top 5 travelers of all of Apple. It was nuts. I had a travel agent in Austin that I would call to make my reservations, and she knew all about what I liked and what I didn't like, and would take all of that into consideration. And so I did that, and I want to back up a little bit though to talk about kind of my technical orientation and some of the things that kind of led a kind of thread through, and we'll get to the Apple network servers piece of it, because that's kind of an important part. Back when I worked at the university and was my love affair with Mac first started, I was given a task that was kind of interesting. This is not so much the Apple story, but kind of started my open systems and more Unix orientation. Was the director of the computer center was also a professor in the CS department. And back then in the days, these are really the dark days of computing with IBM dominating everything, and all of the computer centers around the United States, most of them had IBM mainframes, and they communicated with each other using this communications technology called BISync, which was 24 9600 baud, maybe 56K. Not dial-up, but theirs was all dedicated, and it was a network of all of this, and all predates NSFNet, which predates the internet. They would use a product that IBM sold that was kind of a email calendaring kind of a thing called Profs, and it was really a bizarre piece of product. It goes back to IBM's heritage with 80-column cards. If you wrote an email, it would basically punch 80-column card images on a disk and then send that card deck to another location, and it would either print it or punch it out like it was a printer card punch thing somewhere. And so what the director had an issue is that the CS department, who had VAXs, I think a VAX 780 that was running Unix, they were on something called CSNet. And that was a dial-up network that used UUCP, and they would call up the University of New Mexico's CSNet node, computer science department, and they would exchange email every night. And Joe's frustration is that if he needed to send an email from the CS department to his email account on the profs, it would take 24 hours because that email had to go all the way to the University of Wisconsin, and there was a gateway there between BITNET, that was the network that the university used. Then we get on CSNet, and then it would crawl down to the computer center. So Joe said, hey, I heard there's some software that you can get from Brown University that will basically interface BITNET or the IBM mainframe profs and CSNet. You want to tackle that problem? He said, I bought a Sun 3160 server, and that software supposedly runs on it. And so that's what I did. I took that software and compiled it and learned Unix because I really had absolutely no experience because this was, early on with any of those things. And it was really interesting because that software had one comment in the entire 30,000 lines of code. And that comment was, this doesn't do what you think it does. But anyway, we were able to get that to work. And shortly after that, Apple came and said, hey, are you interested in Unix? And I said, yeah, really, because one of the things that was important at the university is that students had access to PCs, the Macs or IBM PCs, and they had access to the mainframe if they had stuff that they wanted to run on mainframes. And there was a lot of statistical analysis and kind of heavy-duty stuff around the mainframe. But if they wanted to access to, mid-range computing stuff, which at the universities was typically Unix, there wasn't any place for them to go. So another project that I taught the director in is let's buy some Unix machines and buy some Suns, and we bought this crazy 486 multiprocessor kind of computer from, I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, and we would give free accounts to students that wanted to use Unix. Well, Apple came and said, hey, you want to take a look at this thing we have called AUX? And this was in 1986 or 87. It didn't get announced until I think 87. So I had a Mac 2 on my desk, of course, but it needed to have a PMMU, so they had added chip and but I just loved it. I get here all my Mac stuff. It ran Mac, basically it was System 7 on top of System 7 and a lot of BSD extensions. It had an Ethernet, and I could do email and Ethernet and all the stuff you could do on the internet. And because the university had really transitioned to a Ethernet-based network, they had bifurcated that early on with something from Mugger and Bass. It was called baseband. That was more like cable TV. But once Bridge and 3Con came out with products that would allow them to span the entire network with all the buildings, that they went basically that way completely. In fact, I actually have a piece of thick Ethernet and Ethernet terminators at home, and I've showed some of the young engineers that worked for me later in my career to show them what real networking was when there were real men that had to worry about vampire taps and things like that.
Right. Or even when things finally made the switch over to like ThinNet for Ethernet, it's like, all right, who kicked the cable? Who knocked the terminator out?
Yes.
It's tracking your whole dang network to try to find that fault. So I work in higher ed. I feel all the pain with that. We had a mainframe operation until like the mid 90s where you would still get things. You would get jobs and things from the timeshare that would say up in the corner of your printout how many virtual cards that it printed. So I appreciate the stories from that era.
Well, that also my hook into computing happened while I was an undergraduate. Back then the mainframe read 80 column cards, and you waited a minimum of 45 minutes before your job turned up in the little square thing, and there were 100. The last two digits of your social security number, that's where your output would go. And one of the things that I was working at the bank, I was making a little bit of money, and there was a magazine, I think it was weekly, called Computer World. And it was like most newspapers, and back in the day, it had a huge section in the back that was classified ads. And I found back in the back a classified ad for a DECwriter. I was living in an apartment off campus, and a big capability at New Mexico State was this programming language called APL. I don't know if you know anything about APL, but it has this bizarre character set that it uses for its operations. And I could get a DECwriter LA36 with the APL character set on it and an acoustic modem. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven, because I could sit there at my apartment. I could call up the computer center. I could use APL's editor to edit, my programs, regardless of what language they were in. And I could submit those to the batch job queue on the mainframe, and I could get my output back in minutes, not 45 minutes, but just almost instantaneously. So I did that first, and then later, as a graduation present from high school, a bit late, my grandmother bought me an MSI 8080, and I assembled that MSI 8080, because at that time, if you bought one, they were like $500 if you bought it in kit form, and about $1,000 if you put it together. So I at that time had been, my advisor was the head of the CS department. An interesting thing for you, because I didn't really hook onto this until I looked at your email a few days ago. My advisor's name was J. Mac Adams.
Oh, really?
But Mac was his middle name.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the classes he taught was the Introduction to Computer Science, and he hired me as a teaching assistant to do the grading and stuff like that. And I actually built that MSI 8080 computer at NMSU in my little office in the Quonset hut. On the desk, I soldered it and assembled it and everything, and got it to work. Used the DECwriter as the input-output terminal, along with a paper tape reader that I built from hand. Later, actually hand-coded or hand-wrote the BIOS system because I had added two of these things. I have some here, 88-inch floppy disks. I grew up with these. The IBM System 3 was one of the first computers that IBM made that had 8-inch floppies. And so when we transitioned from card-based operations, we used those 8-inch floppies in the System 3, Model 10, and Model 15 that the bank had. So I still have the MSI. I'm a little afraid to turn it on because it's been in a box for the better part of 45 or so years. But right now, my first Macintosh was a Macintosh Plus that I bought while I was at the university when the Mac Plus came out and you could attach a hard drive to it. I have a Super Mac. I can't remember the name of the brand name of the type of drive, but I just have a 10 megabyte disk drive on my Mac Plus. I've completely restored that. That's kind of what I've been doing the last couple of months, making the diskette drives, unclogging them and everything, and rebuilding them, make sure that they work. And so I have several, I think about 4 80 gigabyte floppy drives. My loan-to-own Mac that I got when I was working for Apple was a Mac 2FX. I waited for the fastest Mac 2 that they would make, and I'm in it's running. I have some work to do on the 1.44 megabyte floppies because I want to have a few of those because it would accommodate 2. All of the SCSI hard drives that I have, I think, are long gone, and so I'm transitioning to BlueSCSI. I have 4 or 5 BlueSCSIs that I use those a lot for getting the Mac Plus up and running. Because it was easier to transfer software that way and get system software. But I got to tell you, I probably have 3,000 floppies and probably that many CD-ROMs you collect a lot of CD-ROMs and floppies if you work for Apple for 15 years.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you ever decide that you want to archive any of those things, I'm one of the people in the community. We're very much about preserving that history. So anything we can do to help.
Yeah, Eric from, in fact, actually, that's kind of one of the reasons why I was at the VCF in Chicago a few weeks ago, was I'd seen a post from Eric of BlueSCSI fame that he had a Apple Network server, and he was running, I think it was the 4.14 version of AIX for it, and he had found a copy of 4.15, which was the last version of AIX that was available for that machine, but he couldn't get it. He couldn't get it to work, and it was getting corruption errors, or it wouldn't boot, or something like that. And so I sent him a message on I don't know, one of the vintage websites.
Tinker Different, or
it could have been Tinker Different, or it could have been an M68K. I don't remember which one. But anyway, I sent him a message that says, "Hey, I think I have those CDs. Are you interested in them?" And he says, "Yeah." And I says, "Okay, well, I'll send them to you." And he said, "Yeah." He said he was working on tape support. And I said, "Well, he said he had a tape, but 4mm tape, but he was having a problem with it." And I said, "Well, that's okay. I've got a couple. I'll send you one." And so I put together a care package for him. I sent him. I had an unused Apple Network server RAID card with all the accessories, the CD and everything for it in the box. I actually ended up sending him not only 4mm tape for the ANS, but it was just a generic 4mm tape. It would work on a Mac. I think some of the Mac servers actually had 4mm tapes, drives. And I also sent him an 8mm tape that I had, because I had looked and found out that the 8mm digital tapes that would go in there were hideously expensive, so I wasn't interested in it at all. So I sent those to him, and then that's when he was talking about getting ready for the vintage computer thing in Chicago, and he was going to bring his Apple Network server. And I said, "Well, great." I had wanted to go to the last vintage computer that was in Dallas, but I ran into a personal. I mean, I have grandkids, and they take precedence, so
Sure.
I didn't get to. I think what I really wanted to do was since we were moving from an older house that we lived in for like 35 years to a brand new house that we just had built. I wanted to grab all of my old Apple stuff, throw it on a trailer, take it to Dallas, and say, "Here it is. I don't want this anymore. I don't need it anymore. Have some fun with it, because I don't have time for it." So, but I didn't get to do that. And I wasn't certainly going to, I didn't want to drive the 21 or 23 hours from southern New Mexico to Chicago to take it. But I don't know. I'm seriously thinking about maybe posting some things to say I have all this stuff. I've decided I don't have the time for it. If anybody wants it, just send me an address and I'll ship it to you.
Well,
so
as you can see,
yes.
my basement is ready.
Yeah, I've decided. Well, since I don't have a basement, I have a huge garage, but I don't have a basement. But I've decided I'm going to concentrate on the Mac Plus, the 2FX. I have a Color Classic that I have the Mystic upgrade for,
Very
and
nice.
I have a Power Mac 9600 dual processor, and then the Apple Network server. The bad news is I had like 10 minutes before we got on this thing. I finally opened up. The network server is pretty big. It weighs about 75 pounds, and it was at the old house. This past weekend, I gathered it up and brought it over here, and hadn't done anything with it except put it in my workshop / garage. And then right before this, I finally opened it up, pulled it out, and the battery had blown up on it.
Yeah.
But that's not a big deal. I have two others.
Oh, good. I got backups. Whew. 3,
Yeah.
as they say, 3 is safe. You know, 2 is good, but 3 is safe.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's kind of going to be my inventory of really vintage Macs. I do. After I stopped working for Apple, I had this crazy thing of collecting the after they were really no longer desirable. All of the high-end Macintoshes. So I have a 2-processor G4, or 2-processor G5. I have one of the first, I think it's a 2nd generation Power Mac. And then I have the trash can. I got that for like $220 a couple, maybe 6 months ago, because nobody can't run anything on it. But
moving those away, moving that out as everything is switched over to Apple Silicon.
That's okay. It runs Linux, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I installed Debian on it. And then I have an iMac Pro that I really like. That's kind of my desktop of choice. And I have this one I'm on right now is an M3 PowerBook Pro.
Nice.
So I have quite a few, old Apple things, and I have enough to keeping them all up and running and reasonably safe on my network is enough of a job.
Oh, yeah.
So now with the Apple Network Server, let's see.
Yes.
I mentioned the AUX stuff, and
Mhm.
that kind of got me a connection into what then later would become Apple Business Systems. I promoted MAE. I don't know if you're familiar with MAE, but it was a Macintosh application environment. It actually ran on Solaris and
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
HPUX. So if you had one of those machines, you could run System 7 as a desktop, or in a window on those computers. Not very successful, of course. A lot of the things that Apple Business System did wasn't very successful. And then I got kind of hooked into that through a good friend of mine who was actually interesting when I started in Phoenix. He was the student rep for Arizona State University. Apple hired students to basically do running around and delivering stuff on campus and things like that. And anyway, as he graduated, went to work for Apple in Phoenix as a systems engineer. Then he was there was an education company that did educational software in the Phoenix area, in Tempe or Mesa, one of those places, and he supported them for a while. And then he went out to Cupertino, was on the network server, workgroup server, all the server Apple Business Systems. He was, and he ended up being the product marketing manager for an unannounced Apple workgroup server that was codenamed Deep Dish. It was like, I don't know, for you, that's how it got its name, Deep Dish. It was, it was very different. It was almost identical to a Apple Network Server 700, 200, but it was a case that would, slide into a rack. And when this was all happening, I think it was in late 1996, early 1997, because I think they canceled it shortly after that. The Apple Network Server was on the market for, gosh, maybe not even a year. Anyway, so he got me kind of involved with that, and so I was doing business development kinds of things and server product kind of promotion within my education customers in the West, and a lot of all of that really kind of came through that same kind of lineage of AUX, MAE, all that stuff, and it was I don't know. I mean, I appreciated this because I think a lot of that technology, a lot of the things that Apple learned by putting the Apple desktop on those foreign environments, Unix and the third part, or Sun and HP Unix and stuff, really helped with the transition from Motorola to PowerPC, and then from PowerPC, into some of the really key decisions that I think Steve Jobs made to save the company. In fact, that's actually probably an opportunity for say that if there's one thing, I played a real small part in Apple's success, but I really am proud of all the time that I spent in the 10 years before Steve Jobs came back, basically keeping the doors open, keeping customers, education customers excited about the Macintosh, keeping, the technical customers excited about it. I think back at, in fact, that one of the really most frustrating things in my career at Apple was, well, there was two of them, and I'll talk about both of them. One of them was I was actually on campus the day that the iPod was announced. We were there doing some work on Xserve at the time, and we really felt like Xserve really was a more Apple-oriented kind of product, where the Apple Network Server was just something that Apple kind of tried to do for IBM, and it was just not right. Anyway, we really wanted a capability that was kind of new on the scene for servers, that we really felt like it really played into what our Apple customers wanted, and that was a shared storage system for Xserve. We wanted a SAN. That's really what we wanted.
Yeah.
We wanted a fiber channel SAN so that those videographers, people that were doing videos or doing publishing and stuff where they needed basically guaranteed high-speed access to large amounts of data could have that. And I really think that at that point, Jobs had kind of decided that was a business that didn't really need to have the kind of investment that it needed to really survive. And we were competing against Compaq and and HP and all these raised floor kind of guys that had support, and we didn't have any of that stuff. So it was really frustrating because I was there working on that product, and when the iPod was announced, and I'm thinking, I'm kind of an IT guy, enterprise kind of an oriented guy, and we're making music players.
Yeah,
This doesn't make sense.
We're going into consumer
Yeah.
electronics.
Well,
Didn't we try this once before?
Well, but no, see, I look at it a little differently. I mean, I was actually in the crowd in Boston when they announced the Microsoft deal.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody has really appreciated the impact of that deal, like those of us that worked at Apple at the time. And it wasn't that Microsoft gave Apple a bunch of money. It really was. We were having a real significant problem with all of our customers, whether they were business customers or in higher education, in that a lot of the developers were abandoning the product because it had such a small market share, and it was in reality, it was as easy to develop a Windows application as it was to Windows a Mac application. But why would you do that if 95% of the market is over here and only 5% of the market is over there? And it's the same, the return on your investment is not there. And we had Microsoft reps, unfortunately, running around telling the story to all of our big customers that, well, we're not so sure that Apple's going to make it. We're not so sure that we really want to develop and continue to support Office, which that was a killer. There were a lot of products, something called Banner or something like that in higher education that was only running on PCs, that was hurting the higher ed market. We had to do stupid things like suggest that customers get Citrix so they could run, that as a desktop, a terminal into the Banner system and stuff. And it wasn't working. So that was really the biggest problem. And so having Microsoft come out and have Bill Gates say, no, we're going to continue to support Office on the Macintosh with our products going forward, that in my mind saved the day for Apple. It allowed Apple to basically continue operations. And I really credit, one of the things I really credit with Steve Jobs was when there were just a million things going on at Apple. If you wanted to do it, you could do it. That's kind of where the adult supervision thing came in. And Steve basically shut down a lot of things. And then, the network server was one of them. And the whole server product business was another one that he just said, look, we're not going to win this battle. And I agree. I think what he did, he learned the biggest lesson was how did Microsoft get where they got? How did they basically beat the market? Now they did some things. They got all these hardware manufacturers to race to the bottom and compete on price, and so the only company that was making any money on anything was Microsoft. But he decided they kind of created a whole ecosystem and environment around what the product they were selling. And I think he saw first music to be able to do that, because he understood the problem that people that really want, Napster was going crazy, people are downloading music, they had choices and stuff, and he saw, well, maybe it might be a good thing for us to approach that other side of that, say, hey, look, we can provide you basically an antidote to this problem that you have with people stealing your music, but we got to do this in a way that'll allow people to buy one song. If they have a favorite song, they don't buy that. They'll pay for that, and you'll make some money. We'll make some money. And so I think the strategy was, let's go someplace where we can use our core competencies, the things that we do better than anybody else, and let's create a market where we can own it the way Microsoft owns their market. And that's what they did. They started with music, and then they came up with the phone. Mm-hmm. I've seen some really amazing things about Apple's processor and phone thing that, I mean, I'd heard about it initially, where Steve Jobs goes to Corning and says, I really need some really good glass for my iPhones. And so he works with them. I think he provided probably a lot of, incentive, and maybe even real money to develop this really hard glass. And what he got in return was an exclusive use of that glass, so he could basically lock everybody else out of using that new great thing. And I've read just recently that that's exactly what their Apple is doing right now with the processor technology. Yeah. They basically go to TSMC and say, okay, you want to take all this huge risk on the next generation of processor technology. We'll give you all this money because we have more money than anybody. We'll fund that. And our deal is, we will only pay for the good chips. We won't pay for the ones that are flawed. And we get exclusive use of that new node technology for 1 year. So they're always a year ahead of Qualcomm, Intel, and everybody else. And, they're just buying it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's some pretty amazing business acumen, that's for sure. Where it's
I have to say, if I want to give credit, Tim Cook knows what he's doing. Anyway, that's kind of my story.
Well, that's great. It's very interesting, and we touched on so many amazing things. I've got a few questions that might drag us back through that, but
go ahead.
I'm still absorbing a little bit of this. But as somebody that I work in higher education, I work with a lot of people that in the past had their own Apple connections, people that were like, oh, I worked at the local store to get the discount, and at that level, all the way up to I got to meet John Couch, who was in charge of Apple education for many years.
I told you that in Chicago that I watched your video the day before, and I had worked. Well, I worked for a guy that worked for John Couch when I was in the education team. Yeah.
He's got an amazing book about that.
Yeah, I ordered the book. It took about 3 weeks to get here, but it got here last week, so I haven't had a chance to do anything except crack the cover.
It took me about a week or so to read through it, and then he berated me and said that John Scully read it in 1 day, and I was like, I don't have Pepsi retiree money. I got to go to the regular job, John. Come on. But no, and I got to talk to Barbara Nelson, that was part of the Apple Learning series and things like that. So I mean, as me working in education, and I've worked with so many great educators that have these connections to Apple, I love hearing the stories about working with ed clients and trying to get people kind of under the tent for those products and stuff. So what would you say, as somebody who is worked in education and then worked with Apple, kind of on that side to get people in, what was the most effective way that you kind of reached out to these organizations? Was it just people beating down your door, or was
no.
Was there a time where you really had to try to convince people of the value?
really had to convince them? It was really, it's kind of an old school, salesmanship, even though most of my times is technically oriented, but it was really people to people, and a lot of, in fact, it was one of the great things about being a consulting systems engineer that I told you. One of the strategies that the education team came up with was they made a deal with manufacturing with all new products. There was a cycle that products went through. There was prototypes, there was engineering validation, then manufacturing validation, and then there was what they called first off the line. And so the education part of Apple said, hey, manufacturing, we need 50, 60, 70 of the very first of any product that comes off the line. And because we need to get out in front of our customers, so that kind of leads into that, face to face, being there, and as a consulting engineer, what they did was we got those products before they were actually announced. They would show up on my doorstop. And here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, just sitting there, and we would know they were coming, or at least more before Steve Jobs came back, before the CIA took over the security apparatus at Apple. But we would do briefings too on new products and stuff. So we kind of knew what was happening, but we get new products and then and know they were coming, and we would talk with the sales reps that were part of the area that we covered, and we would say, hey, we have these PowerBooks that are coming out, 100, 140, 170, and we'll have some. Do you want to set something up with your customers? So I would fly to UCLA, I would fly to Berkeley, I would fly to Stanford, I would fly to University of Washington, all these different, all over the place, with these computers right after they announced, and that's how they could use a small number, in our case it would be like 10 for education, and then we would go off and we would demonstrate those and show them and stuff like that. I can remember when the first airports came out, we would go and plug them in and show people how Wi-Fi worked. It was, but what it really was, and a lot of the universities that we did business with was really because we had sales reps that were there all the time, and they met with the IS management team, they met with the vice presidents, they met with the deans, and they had a personal relationship with them, and that. I think that's one of the reasons Apple was successful. And they did the same thing on the K-12 side. I just didn't have a whole lot to do, with K-12, except around here. A lot of times those old machines, after I got them and didn't want to store them anymore, I would go to, a school and say, hey, would you like to have this, Performa or whatever that came, and I would give it to them.
That's really great. It's
hope Apple doesn't get too mad about that.
Well, at this point, I'm sure they're like, yeah, that's great. That's good PR. But I would expect you would go to some of these places and be like, I don't know, I still got all the educators I talk to, people that are like, they've been a grade school teacher for 30 years. They're like, oh no, I've still got my Mac LC. Oh, yeah. It's fine. I'm still using it. It's like, that's something that I think anybody that's ever worked at Apple can be really proud of. The engineering and the quality of the products that they sold and made were just outstanding. There's nothing to meet it. In fact, that's one of the reasons why, places like, Cray and like that, they take a look at the logic boards, and they see how things are done, and they say this is top quality stuff. Yeah, absolutely. How important were events like EDUCAUSE and things like that back in the old days for kind of that evangelism of getting people excited about whatever is next? I know that EDUCAUSE is still something that is going on today.
Yeah.
But how important was it for you working kind of in the higher ed team back in those days?
I really didn't do any more. In fact, I don't remember, but then again, it's been quite many years. Don't remember a lot of that. I think, mostly, Macworlds. And those were, incredible. Like I said, I was in Boston when the Microsoft deal was. After they moved from Boston to New York City, when they announced one of my favorite Macs, the Cube, which somebody that hated, but I still love it.
No, it's a brilliant piece of engineering, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the
don't let the
product
video
marketing
card overheat.
Yeah, the product marketing guy for that was a junior after he moved. Before he moved to Cupertino, was a systems engineers in the LA office. Mm-hmm. And I think he really, that whole team was, this is the Macintosh version of the next Cube, one cable, little square box, everything all built in. Anyway.
Well, the Microsoft deal was Macworld Boston 97.
Yeah.
So that was also the year of Steve Jobs returning and all of that.
Yeah.
Were you at the 96 Boston Macworld? That's the one where Gil Amelio did the keynote about kind of paring down the product line at the exact same event where they debuted the Apple Network server. So it's like, hey, here's a very expensive box. Won't be able to buy it next year, so it's really good you get your orders in now.
Well, they didn't.
No, I actually worked for I used to work for Southern Illinois University. My old boss, Matt McCrimmon, really great guy, like Apple diehard. We had a ANS 500.
Yeah.
That the whole plan was that we were going to try to get away, because I think our previous, it was a Mac 2 that had like a whole stack of drives and things like that. That was still our Apple Share server, and they had a backup that was like an AUX machine that was running on like an SE30 or something like that, just as like rollover. And so the plan was we were going to retire some of this old equipment. We were going to move everything over to the ENS 500. And that was such a slow operation. It literally was like a whole year of like slowly like recreating the groups and kind of getting the knowledge base required to make that move to AIX. And then right as everything finished up on that project, that's when it was discontinued. And he was so mad. He was like, I can't believe it. I've got all this knowledge. But they still used it for several years after that. But then I think that they, because we never completely got away from the AUX box, there was just a day where they downed the ANS 500 and just seamlessly switch back over to a Mac that had like an Ethernet card that was no longer doing Apple Talk over phone net.
So they didn't know about the free deal that Apple offered?
They may have, but again, this has been so long ago that it's something that's probably been in and out of my memory. And then I was just an employee at the time, so I kind of got a lot of this stuff secondhand from him.
Because what I had heard was, I think prior to the public announcement that the NS was going to be discontinued, that they had a huge inventory of those. And that they had to any university that wanted one. And now I don't know how that was communicated, but I do know that they offered any university that would pay for the shipping and the license for EIX, which was like $1,100, something like that they could have one. Because that was a sneaky thing too, to keep the price of the total cost of ownership kind of artificially low, was to just sell hardware. I understand that it's the whole IBM partnership thing, but then it was like being absolutely forced to then buy that AIX license. It was just sort of like, I guess in for a penny, in for another £1,000, but it was I do remember that being kind of a point of contention back then too. Now that you do bring it up about the universities being able to get some of those things at no charge, I think we may have gotten a couple of power supplies or something like that, just like for backup parts. But I don't recall if that was something that was directly through Apple or that was through like some kind of partnership program. But could have been.
I remember there was a fire sale. And I remember that the education clients and Apple still ended up with like a huge amount of back inventory on that, just because not everybody took them up on the offer. But
I had heard only one university in the whole United States took the offer, and I actually got had shipped to me in that kind of same effort a complete set of 9 gigabyte drives for the ANS in the sleds. That's where the 8mm tape drive came from. That's where the RAID card came from. I had everything else. I'd had the 4mm drive and the memory and stuff like that, so I didn't need anything else.
This is not an exact price quote, but those 9 gig drives were something like $3,000. Back in the day.
They were all made by him.
Oh my gosh! And then the 8mm tape drive was like $12,000 or something like that. I mean, it was a crazy amount of money. Like, I can't even imagine. But I mean, again, these are you're talking about targeting like a corporate client and stuff like that. Those people had deep pockets. This was not for little old me making ramen, over a single match in the dark. It was for people that could afford it. But I get it. So story is, and I this might be revealing a little bit, and if you can't talk about it, it's okay. But it kind of the whole thing with the AIX partnership with IBM, that it was very famously, these machines do not run the Macintosh operating system.
That's
But I had
with the
heard,
shippable ROM, they don't.
right. I heard that you may have a very exclusive piece of hardware that allows
Yeah,
the ANS to run the Mac OS.
yeah, I
Can
do.
you talk about it?
Well, I'm struggling with that right now. In fact,
Okay.
actually, just again, one of the other things that I did, because it was the 700 that actually had that ROM in it. Let me give you a little bit of the backstory. Okay,
Okay.
this was during the time where Copeland was exploding. Copeland only existed as a Macromedia, mock-up.
A mock-up, yeah.
So if you saw Copeland, that you were watching Macromedia. So, jobs had come back. The company was struggling about what are we going to do? Because I would explain it to customers about really kind of the marvel of engineering at Apple, especially from the software perspective, is that they, this Macintosh, when the original Mac came out, Apple was embarrassed that it took 128K bytes of memory, because PCs would run in 16 and the amounts of memory, and the original Macintosh had 400K floppies, and you scroll forward where people still were running System 7, System 8, maybe even System 9, and you had big drives that and you had not 128 kilobytes of memory. You'd have a megabyte on the entry level Mac Plus up to 4. The whole, if you look at it again from my computer science background, I mean it's amazing that they could have stretched that architecture as far as they did. And again, that kind of goes back to, I think, the wonderment of their open systems Unix kind of orientation along the way is that besides Steve Jobs kind of deciding where he was going to focus, but his thoughts about having this common platform for development for now everything from iPods, iPhones, iPads, Macs, servers. You could devote, basically have the same kind of development environment and the same kind of system structure under it, with this kind of customized, you want to call it mock or Unix or whatever, but you have this kind of consistency across the board. That's a way, to capture more developer mind share. Not, now, I mean, there's there are more iPhones on the planet than there are people almost. So, but that was a genius, of that.
Absolutely. I think about just all of the things where it's just sort of like trying to stretch the capabilities of all of that, and how Apple, like you've brought up like the iPhone and all these other consumer electronics devices and things like that, just how much the company has changed and just where the focus has been, and how much of it's sort of like that these things became kind of that moment, kind of like Walt Disney, where every time Walt made a movie, every time they made an animated feature, they were betting the company every time. So they needed something that was going to be that underpinning, that was going to just basically hold everything so you could try and do amazing new stuff. And for them, it ended up being theme parks. But then, for Apple, it was like that consumer electronics division where it's just sort of like, now we can go back and visit some of these other things, try some of these other projects, but then try to figure out what is our real core competencies? What are the things we want to focus on? And then just kind of like, unfortunately, there are some really innovative things that Apple was doing that ended up just getting thrown to the sides.
Well, but if you think about where we are today, one of the things that I think is really kind of interesting, actually, I'll make a comparison. Two things. If you look at what Apple did with ARM, basically.
Yeah.
So they come up with a Newton, right? With all the right reasons, but they were way ahead of their time in making that decision. But they said, look, we need to have something that's powerful, that runs on batteries, and that's going to be portable. And so they make an investment in ARM, and I'll look where ARM is today.
Yeah.
Basically killing Intel mostly.
Yes. Yep.
I contrast that with an interesting thing. If you look back at, this is part of the Microsoft deal, right? So Microsoft got $300 million worth of restricted stock in Apple as part of that agreement and stuff like that. And what did Steve Ballmer do? Steve Ballmer sold that stock as soon as he could. As soon as the time limit ran out, he sold it. And sure, he made a 30% return on that investment. Not a bad return. But if he would have kept that until, even as long ago as 5 years ago, it would have been worth billions of dollars. So I think Apple was it had a lot of really smart people, and some of the decisions that they made were the right decisions. They just didn't execute on them, and they were way too far ahead of their time. I think the Newton was, but they did that. You look at the investment that they made. If you look at what the return on the investment that Apple made with Adobe, going in early, and they provide a lot of the seed funding for Adobe to become, the company that it became. So there's a lot of good things about that have happened around Apple. And like I said, I'm really proud of what Apple was and what they've become, and really kind of, as much as I think that social media is kind of a stain on our culture, that's one of the things that I really regret, is kind of how the influence that Apple has had on social media as an enabler. Not that they have any direct responsibility, but they've enabled all of this awful stuff that's going on because they provided a way to connect people. And it does still bother me that we don't produce newspapers anymore.
Right. No, I agree. I'm one of those people that we thankfully we still have a student paper on our campus that is printed on actual dead trees. It doesn't come out as often as it used to, but it still comes out. So there's opportunity for journalism students and for people that want to keep some of that legacy media stuff alive. It's I'm one of those people that makes sure that with everything that's been happening in the world, that I upped my donation, my monthly donation to our local public radio. And, I understand the value of a lot of these things, because even today, not everybody necessarily has access to all the same things, and all of this stuff has value. That's for sure. So I want to see it continue, but for all of the regrets that any of us have in our lives, it will never be as much regret as Ronald Wayne has for getting rid of those original those original shares. But you know what, though? You make the right decision at the time. I really wanted to get that large pizza. I had to trade them off. I'm sorry. From a personal perspective of that, it was really difficult for me to leave Apple, because really I was really old school Apple. I've told people, if you cut me, I bleed 6 colors. Even after Steve Jobs changed the logo, I still bleed 6 colors. But for me personally, at the time that I left, I was 50 years old. I actually weighed about 100 pounds more than I weighed right now. Again, because when you're traveling as much as I was 4 or 5 days a week, and you're on my expense account was just unbelievable. When I worked at Apple, you almost couldn't spend enough money. So I was eating out all the time, and if I wanted to have cheesecake for dessert, I could have cheesecake for dessert. I could eat whatever I wanted, and it was literally killing me. So I'm happy. The career that I walked into, or really fell into after leaving Apple, was really different. It was more of a public service kind of career. It's been really, as proud of I am of Apple, but the almost 19 years I spent with the Lockheed Martin company, serving our country was a privilege. Absolutely. I know that just because of the nature of that work, I didn't want to pry or ask any questions more about that, but
there's some things I can say, some things I can't. Although I am also very, very, very proud of also another fact that I think is interesting, and I haven't really been able to. I've almost been thinking about contacting Steve Wozniak and asking him, but I am got every piece of evidence that I think that Steve Wozniak's father, who worked for Lockheed Martin in Sunnyvale, he may have worked at the in the part of Lockheed that got me my job with Lockheed. They moved a command and control mission from the Sunnyvale area out to White Sands, and that's where I worked for Lockheed. And an interesting story, and probably nobody cares a lot about this than me, but in San Jose and San Francisco in the Bay Area, there's two highways. There's Highway 101, which goes up the east side of the bay towards San Francisco from San Jose. And then there's Highway 280 that goes up the east side, or the west side, I'm sorry. And the mission that I was involved with operated out of a building there. It's at the corner of Matilda and 101, and it was called the Blue Cube. They actually tore that down a few years ago, and as a kind of reward, some of the people there actually sent me a little square block of the blue cube with the blue paint, a little memento that I have. But I went out there when I first started to support the mission and was visiting, and I thought, well, I'm gonna go just see what it's like at Apple nowadays. This was before they built the new headquarters building. It was still the old Infinite Loop. Yeah. And I started driving on Matilda. And if you drive on Matilda toward 280, and you drive and drive and drive, the street name changes several times, but where you end up is on De Anza Boulevard. And Apple is at the corner of 280 and De Anza Boulevard. So my past employers both are kind of on the same street, in Silicon Valley. And I thought it was really interesting. That was another thing that actually happened too. Then Apple had a kind of a acknowledgement of one of the anniversaries of the Mac. I think was it 40 years? I think it was in 2014 maybe. And they had a big celebration on campus. I went out there to meet with some colleagues that I had worked with, the systems engineer for Stanford and Berkeley. We had dinner. We couldn't get to campus. There were so many people on campus. There was no parking. Couldn't get there. But interesting thing is, they had banners up around all of Infinite Loop on the outside of the building, and they had every name of every person that had ever worked at Apple was printed on those banners. This was on a Friday night. They had a big meeting at De Anza Community College. That's where the original Macintosh was announced. They had a bunch of engineers and guys that had worked on the original Mac there to talk about their Steve Jobs stories and how they built the Mac and all that stuff. It was really, really kind of neat. Came back the next morning and I was really, really disappointed because they had taken all those banners down, because I really, really wanted to get my camera out and take a picture of my name on that banner, but I missed out on it.
Well, I'll have to look. There's a great book that's called So Far that has tons of people's names in the back. And I mean, absolutely tons. I don't own a copy of the book. I need to get a copy of the book. But
yeah, me too.
I know several people that have it. I will have to. It's nicely alphabetical, so I'll have to say, hey, can you find John's name in there?
I need to do that. It's called what? What's the name of the title of the book?
So far.
I think I've tried really hard to collect all of the books about Apple that I've been able to collect. I actually have the one that is a collection of all the T-shirts, and many of those T-shirts I actually had because I didn't keep many of them. There were T-shirts at Apple are just like a phenomena. They're just, thousands of them. So what I would do is, after I would get one and it was several years old, I would give it to my younger brother who worked for the highway department, and he would wear them. But yeah,
thanks for these shirts. Oh,
so yeah.
There's so many of those great. Speaking of those shirts, there's so many great ones. There's a few that I've really liked that I've gone through and just kind of like recreated the artwork and stuff, and then just like did a single print of it for myself. And you show up places and people see those shirts and be like, "That was from that Apple Music event," and it's like, "How did you get one of those shirts in 4X?" And I was like, "I'll never tell for legal reasons."
Yeah. Have you seen the one with the chicken with the lipsticks on?
I guess maybe not, but
Yeah. So one of the things that the engineers, the systems engineers specifically, Apple and it was really interesting because in the time I worked at Apple, this always happened on the Monday. It started the Monday after Mother's Day. So I was never home on Mother's Day for all that time that I worked at Apple, but they would have the developers conference, and typically originally it was always at the San Jose Convention Center. But yeah, they had that T-shirt was handed out at one of those, and it had something to do with Microsoft, and that you really couldn't put lipstick on a chicken.
Right. It's funny.
Yeah, there are a lot of really funny ones. I have some too, because I was, in fact, if you wear a large shirt, I'll send you some that I have that are too large for me.
I will tell you what, I am a huge person, if you can't tell on camera.
No, I can't.
I'm 6'5". Send me whatever you want. It only takes 3 large shirts to make it all the way around.
Yeah,
actually, you were talking about, because I am 50 adjacent, sir. And so I completely understand that point where you're just sort of like, I've got to make that change for health, or whatever. So I am down 85 pounds since last year. And it's all walking and diet and keeping your sugars under control and just trying to make good choices. So I get it.
I took the easy way out. I back in 2010, I think I had gastric bypass surgery, which was amazing.
Sure. Life changing.
I had high blood pressure. I was pre-diabetic. In fact, actually, that's what forced me to actually do that, because I went to I saw my doctor every 90 days and had blood tests and stuff. And he said, look, the medicine you're taking for your type 2 diabetes is just, it's run its course. You're really going to need to go see an endocrinologist and start talking about taking insulin. And I said, well, Bill, because my doctor's a very good friend of mine. Our sons played football together, and I've known him since we were in high school. I said, well, Bill, what about bypass? And he said, what do you mean? You don't need heart bypass. And I said, no, what about gastric bypass? And he said, I said, I've looked into it. I checked with my insurance company, and they said, well, if your BMI is over, I don't know, 35 or something, or I don't know, some number, and you have any of these other things. Well, I had like 3 of those other things. Right. And they said, we'll pay for it. And the amazing thing about that was, this is kind of off topic, but is that that they gave me insulin while I was in the hospital, but I have not taken anything for diabetes since then. And
That's excellent.
It's been 15 years.
And it is of interest, because there's lots of people in this community that have those exact same struggles. So I am someone that has struggled with blood sugar forever. Would go to the doctor every 3 months, do all of that. The doctor was like, your blood sugar was great, ... If it was a topping for pancakes, you're going to have to do something. So
what frustrated me the most is early on was, it was like, well, wait a minute, Bill, you told me if it was below like 7, it was okay. Now you're telling me if it's got to be below 6. I said, you're moving the goalposts on me.
I know. Yeah. The last time I went, 5.8. Doing really great. It's taken a long time to kind of get that all corrected. So, and it is not easy. Again, there's a lot of people in this hobby, in this profession, that struggle with all of this stuff. So any efforts that people make is
before that I tried everything. Starting in 2003, actually several months before I resigned from Apple, I started swimming, and I swam virtually every day. The university here allows alumni to pay a fee and swim at the university. Parking regulations don't start until 7 o'clock in the morning, and the natatorium opens at 6. And so literally for 20 years at 6 o'clock in the morning, I was there swimming for 45 minutes, maybe, but I would swim at least half a mile every day. And up until the time I had the surgery, it really wasn't, mediating my, blood sugar or my weight at all. And in fact, the company gave us pedometers to wear. And if you achieve certain goals, they would add money to your health fund account
Right.
to help pay for, the things. And so I was doing both. I would walk 4 or 5 miles a day, and I would go swimming, and I would get credit for all of that, and it just wasn't working. So that's why I just said, "Oh, I'm going to do this if it works out," and it did.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly glad that it did, because again, this is such a struggle for myself included. I've always been heavy, and so it absolutely, I say heavy because I'm trying to be nice to little kid version of me that still lives in here. So, but it's taken a lot. It takes a lot to kind of make those big changes and stuff. So I'm glad that all worked out for you, sir. It's something else, but. So, well, we are coming up here on about an hour and a half. Do you have anything else you might want to share? Are there any other cool prototypes or anything hanging out in your garage, or?
No, nothing. I mean, I have some other, prototypes of things, but like of PowerBook that they called Blackbird or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
One of those.
500 series. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are great little machines. If you if you find one that all the plastic is intact.
Yeah. So no, that's kind of pretty much it.
John, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your evening.
No problem.
Yeah.